The brass ring in my hand is still warm from the strike. Jim's fingers twitch where I hit him. My husband's storage unit guard, now blocking my only exit. The elevator doors won't open again, and the replica of my bedroom down the hall isn't for storage. It's a stage. And the photos on the dresser? They're not me. They're her. I'm holding keys Mark never knew I had. The lavender scent is identical to mine. If I don't get out now, I'll be the next thing locked in Unit 402. The steering wheel bit into Sarah's palms, the leather slick with a thin film of sweat. 20 yards ahead, Mark's silver SUV signaled right, turning into the gravel lot of Safekeep storage. She eased her foot off the accelerator, letting her sedan coast until the tires crunched softly against the roadside weeds. The scent of hot asphalt and wild onion filled the cabin as she rolled the window down an inch. Mark stepped out of his car, the heavy thud of the door echoing against the corrugated metal units. He didn't scan the street. He didn't pause. He moved with a practiced, brisk efficiency that tightened the knot in Sarah's stomach. A chain rattled against a gate. The screech of a sliding bolt pierced the humid afternoon air. She watched his broad shoulders disappear into the shadows of the facility. A hummingbird hovered near her side mirror, its wings a frantic blur of gray, before darting toward the overgrown fence. Sarah gripped the door handle, her thumb tracing the cold plastic. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, a rhythmic drumming that drowned out the distant hum of the highway. What fits in a 10 by 10 box? Not a mistress, not a second life. He emerged carrying a small taped carton, his face set in a grim mask she failed to recognize. He looked older under the harsh fluorescent glare of the hallway. Sarah shifted in her seat, the fabric of her blouse sticking to her spine. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over his name in the contact list. But her hand shook. The silence inside the car grew heavy, smelling of stale coffee and the looming wreck of a decade spent trusting the wrong man. She waited until his SUV had cleared the horizon, the red glow of his taillights vanishing into the dusk of Oak Ridge. The town was too quiet tonight, the kind of silence that felt like a held breath. She pulled her car forward, the tires whispering over the gravel. Her mind was a calculator, already measuring the distance from the gate to the front office. She needed to know what was in that unit. She needed the dimensions of his secrets. The gravel crunched under her boots as she stepped out into the humid air. The facility loomed like a fortress of corrugated steel, its silver skin reflecting the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Sarah reached into her purse and felt the familiar, cold weight of her laser measurer. It was her anchor. When the world became a blur of lies, the red dot on the wall told her exactly where she stood. She approached the main gate, her eyes scanning the keypad. A shadow detached itself from the side of the cinderblock office. It was a man, wide-shouldered and heavy-set, his uniform shirt strained across a barrel chest. He moved with a slight, rhythmic limp, and as he drew closer, Sarah heard a low, muttered cadence. 22, 23, 24. He stopped at the gate, his boots planting firmly on the concrete. This was Jim, the night watchman. His face looked like a piece of crumpled parchment that had been left out in the rain, and he smelled of sour tobacco and old coffee. Closed, Jim grunted. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her hands. Gate locks at 6. You're 10 minutes late, lady. I just need to check a unit, Sarah said, her voice tight but precise. She kept her feet exactly shoulder-width apart, mirroring the structural stability she sought. My husband was just here. Unit 402. I have the key. Jim stepped into her personal space, the jingle of a massive ring of keys hanging from his belt sounding like a warning. I don't care if you have the key to the city. Rules are rules. Move your car or I'm calling the tow. He saw her hand tighten around her phone, which she had begun to lift to record the interaction. Give me that. No recording on private property. He lunged, his thick fingers reaching for the device. Sarah didn't think. She reacted with the practiced grace of a woman who spent her life navigating construction sites. She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy brass sample ring, a collection of metal finishes she used for kitchen hardware. As his hand closed toward her, she swung the ring. The heavy metal bit into his knuckles with a dull thwack. Jim let out a low, menacing growl, clutching his hand. You little... Sarah didn't wait for him to finish. She ducked under his reaching arm, the scent of his unwashed jacket filling her nose for a terrifying second, and bolted toward the heavy steel door that led to the interior units. The door was heavy, the handle cold and industrial, but it swung open with a groan of protesting hinges. She slipped inside and slammed the bolt home, hearing Jim's heavy boots thudding against the exterior metal. 1, 2, 3. She heard him start again through the steel, a rhythmic counting that signaled his ascent up the stairs to find another way in. The hallway was a tunnel of oppressive perspective. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, with a high-pitched electrical buzz that vibrated in Sarah's inner ear, making her feel as though the floor were tilting. The air was sterile, smelling of ozone and burnt dust. She began to walk, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. Each unit door was a slab of silver, a silent witness to 1,000 hidden lives. Unit 402, she whispered. The numbers were embossed in black plastic. She reached the door and paused. Her thumb traced the index finger of her left hand, tapping out a rapid, rhythmic beat. She pulled the key from her pocket, the one she'd found hidden in the lining of Mark's briefcase. It slid into the padlock with a sickeningly smooth click. She rolled the shutter up. The sound was a deafening shriek of metal on metal that echoed through the hollow hallway. Sarah stepped inside and froze. The air hit her first. It was chilled to exactly 68 degrees, the unnaturally still atmosphere carrying a scent so familiar it made her knees weak. Lavender. Not the fresh floral scent of a garden, but the concentrated, oily smell of the candles she kept on her nightstand at home. She clicked on her laser measurer. The red dot danced across the far wall. 10 feet. She turned it to the side. 10 feet, a perfect square. But inside that square was a nightmare. It was a replica, a hyper-accurate surgical recreation of her own bedroom. The eggshell blue wallpaper was an exact match. The crown molding had the same slight gap in the corner where the house had settled. The bed was made with the same high thread count Egyptian cotton sheets, pulled tight without a single wrinkle. Even the book on the nightstand, a biography of Frank Lloyd Wright, was dog-eared at page 114, exactly where she had left her copy 2 nights ago. This isn't real, she breathed, her voice sounding thin and hollow in the windowless space. She walked to the dresser, her fingers trembling as she touched the polished mahogany. It felt solid. It felt right. But the geometry of the situation was impossible. This was a box in a warehouse, yet it felt more like home than the house she had left an hour ago. Her gaze drifted to the framed photos resting on the dresser. She expected to see her own face smiling back, perhaps from their wedding in Napa or the trip to Maine. She picked up the silver frame. The woman in the photo was wearing Sarah's favorite emerald silk blouse. She was standing in Sarah's kitchen, holding a mug that Sarah had bought in a pottery shop in Vermont. She had Sarah's hair cut into a sharp, Professional Bob. She had Sarah's posture, the slight tilt of the head that suggested a constant state of observation. But it wasn't Sarah. The eyes were too large, a deep, searching brown instead of Sarah's piercing gray. The jawline was softer, lacking the tension Sarah carried like a shield. She looked younger, perhaps 25. Her expression one of a script-bound actress trying to find her mark. Sarah's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the other photos. The woman, this stranger, was everywhere. She was sitting on Sarah's sofa. She was sleeping in Sarah's bed. Sarah's thumb began to tap her index finger so hard it hurt. She looked down at the dresser and saw a legal document resting near the frames. It was an insurance form, the paper crisp and white. Name of insured, Elena Brooks. The name felt like a physical blow. Sarah leaned against the wall, the cold metal of the unit's exterior shell biting through the wallpaper and into her shoulder. Mark hadn't just built a room. He had built a life. He had found a woman and shaped her into a vessel for Sarah's identity. The storage unit wasn't for furniture. It was a staging ground for a replacement. A faint mechanical hum broke the silence. Sarah's head snapped up. In the upper corner of the room, tucked into the shadow of the crown molding, a small black sphere rotated. A lens, no larger than a marble, glinted under the fluorescent light. A tiny status light, previously dark, suddenly flared into a steady, predatory red. He was watching. The realization sent a jolt of pure, icy adrenaline through her. Mark was on the other end of that lens, sitting in his office or parked on a dark street, watching her realize the depth of his betrayal. The red light felt like a laser burn on her skin. She had to move. She had to get out. But the architect in her wouldn't let her leave without the data. She scanned the room, looking for the source of the camera's power. Behind the heavy mahogany wardrobe, she caught a glimpse of a black cable snaking along the baseboard. She shoved the wardrobe aside, the wood groaning against the floor, and found a hidden terminal. A laptop sat on a pull-out tray, its screen glowing with a series of complex windows. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't need to be a computer expert to know what she was looking for. She needed the access logs. She needed to know how many times he had brought Elena here. How long had this been going on? She found the file marked safe keep underscore, logs underscore 402. She clicked. A red box flashed on the screen. Access denied. She tried again, her breath coming in shallow hitches. The system wasn't just password protected. It was wrapped in layers of complex, military-grade security that she couldn't even begin to navigate. It was like a locked door with a keyhole she couldn't find. The folders were visible, but their contents were scrambled, a mess of gibberish that refused to resolve into a readable format. "Come on," she hissed, slamming her palm against the desk. The sound echoed in the small room, flat and dead. The encryption was a wall she couldn't scale, a structural barrier designed to keep her exactly where she was, in the dark. A sudden chime startled her. It was high-pitched and melodic. On the nightstand, the antique music box, the one Mark had given her for their 5th anniversary, began to spin. The tiny ballerina rose and began her limping dance to the tune of Moon River, their wedding song. Sarah approached it as if it were a live grenade. The music sounded tinny and distorted in the cold air. She picked it up, her fingers finding a small, recessed button on the bottom she had never noticed before. A hidden compartment clicked open. Inside wasn't a piece of jewelry. It was a folded sheet of heavy bond paper. She smoothed it out on the bed. It was a life insurance policy, recently executed. Beneficiary, Mark Miller. Insured, Elena Brooks. Amount, $2 million. The scent of lavender suddenly felt suffocating, like a thick, oily film coating her throat. Mark wasn't just replacing her, he was staging a tragedy. Elena Brooks wasn't just an actress. She was a sacrificial lamb, a version of Sarah that could be lost while the real Sarah was... What? A heavy thud sounded from the hallway, then another. The rhythmic counting started again, but it wasn't Jim's voice. This voice was lower, smoother, and utterly devoid of emotion. 31, 32, 33. Sarah lunged for the rolling shutter, but before her fingers could touch the handle, a hand slammed against the metal from the outside. The shutter flew up with a violent crash. Standing in the doorway was a man Sarah had seen at Mark's office. Robert Miller, no relation, just an associate, with eyes the color of frozen slush. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting at his sides. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was assessing a structural flaw in a building. "You shouldn't be here, Sarah," Miller said. His voice was a flat monotone. "The composition isn't finished. Where is he?" Sarah demanded, backing away until her heels hit the edge of the replica bed. "Where is Mark?" Miller stepped into the unit, his presence instantly making the 10 by 10 space feel like a coffin. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folding knife, the blade flicking open with a sharp, metallic snick. "Mark is a perfectionist, and you've become a very messy variable." He lunged. Sarah scrambled across the bed, the silk sheets sliding under her. She grabbed the Frank Lloyd Wright biography and hurled it at his face. He swerved, the book thudding against the wall, and the blade sliced through the air where her arm had been a second before. She dived for the hallway, her heart hammering against her teeth. Miller was fast, his boots silent on the concrete. But Sarah knew the geometry of the facility better than he did. She had mapped the sight lines on her way in. She knew where the blind spots were. She sprinted down the narrow corridor, the fluorescent lights strobing overhead. Miller was right behind her, the rhythmic thud of his pursuit echoing off the metal lockers. She saw a heavy rolling shutter halfway down the hall, used for closing off sections of the facility for maintenance. She reached it and grabbed the yellow handle. "Come on!" she screamed, putting every ounce of her weight into the pull. Miller was 10 feet away, his face a mask of cold determination. He reached out, his fingers inches from her shoulder. The shutter slammed down. The sound was like a gunshot. Miller's hand vanished behind the steel just as the lock clicked into place. Sarah heard him hit the metal on the other side, a dull, heavy impact. She leaned against the opposite wall, gasping for air. Her lungs burned with the smell of ozone. She looked down and saw a manila folder that had fallen from Miller's coat during the struggle. She picked it up, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped it. Inside was a contract from a local casting agency. Project, living installation. Subject, Sarah Miller. Performer, Elena Brooks. Notes. Subject must maintain strict adherence to postural guidelines. No deviations from the script. Sarah's mind spun. Elena wasn't a mistress. She was a puppet. Mark hadn't fallen in love with someone else. He had fallen in love with a version of Sarah he could control. He was a curator, and she was a piece of art that had started to talk back. She looked back toward Unit 402. The red light of the camera was still glowing. Mark was watching. He would be coming now. He would be coming to fix the variable. "Okay," she whispered, her thumb tapping a frantic rhythm against her finger. "You want a performance? I'll give you a performance." She didn't run for the exit. She turned back toward the unit. She had to get inside. She had to turn his own stage against him. She slipped back into the replica bedroom. The music box had stopped playing, leaving the room in a heavy, lavender-scented silence. She walked to the closet, a perfect recreation of her walk-in at home, and stepped inside. She pulled the slatted door shut, the wood smelling of cedar and her own perfume. She waited. Minutes felt like hours. The temperature in the unit seemed to drop. Sarah watched through the narrow slats of the closet door, her eyes fixed on the rolling shutter. Then she heard it. The soft, rhythmic crunch of gravel outside, followed by the smooth hum of an electric motor. The storage facility door opened. Steps approached. 2 sets. One heavy and deliberate, the other light and hesitant. The shutter of Unit 402 rolled up. Mark stepped into the room. He looked exactly as he had that morning. Crisp white shirt, perfectly knotted tie, his face a mask of calm, predatory symmetry. Behind him followed Elena. Up close, the resemblance was even more terrifying. Elena was wearing Sarah's favorite gray wool dress. She walked with Sarah's slight limp, a remnant of a skiing accident Mark had never let her forget. "The light is wrong," Mark said. His voice was a warm fog, filling the small space. He didn't look at Elena. He looked at the dresser. Sarah was here. She moved the wardrobe. Elena stood in the center of the room, her shoulders hunched. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry, floor. I'm sorry, wall." "Don't apologize to the architecture, Elena," Mark said, his voice sharpening. "Sarah doesn't apologize. She measures. She judges." He walked over to Elena and took her arm. He didn't touch her with affection. He touched her like a sculptor working with clay. He lifted her chin, tilting it 3 degrees to the left. He moved her right foot back an inch. "This is the 2018 composition," Mark murmured, his eyes glazed with a terrifying intensity. "The night of the gallery opening. You were tired, but you were defiant. Your spine was a steel rod." He pushed down on Elena's shoulders, forcing her into a specific, rigid posture. Elena winced, her eyes welling with tears, but she didn't move. She was a statue. "Perfect," Mark whispered. He turned toward the closet. Sarah held her breath, her heart a drum in her ears. She could see the glint of his eyes through the slats. He looked like he was listening to the house breathe. "But the composition is still off," Mark said. He moved toward the closet with the slow, inevitable grace of a predator. Sarah pressed her back against the hanging clothes, the fabric of her own coats muffling her movements. He reached for the handle. "I can hear you, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate crawl. "I can hear the math in your head. It's too loud." He ripped the door open. The light flooded in, blinding her for a second. Sarah lunged out of the darkness, her hands reaching for his throat, but Mark was ready. He caught her wrists with a strength that felt like iron bands. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. He threw her back onto the bed. Sarah scrambled to find a weapon, her hand closing around the heavy mahogany lamp on the nightstand. A gift he'd given her for their 3rd anniversary. She swung it with everything she had. The base caught him on the shoulder. Mark didn't cry out. He just grunted, the impact barely slowing him down. He lunged forward, pinning her against the mattress. "Stop," he hissed. "You're ruining the lines." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of heavy-duty plastic zip ties. With clinical efficiency, he jerked her hands together. The plastic bit into her skin, the zip, zip, zip sound echoing like a death knell in the small room. "There," he said, stepping back and smoothing his hair. Now we can talk about the future. Sarah lay on the bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Elena stood in the corner, her eyes wide with terror, her body still frozen in the 2018 posture Mark had demanded. "You're insane," Sarah spat, her voice raw. "Insanity is a matter of perspective, Sarah," Mark said. He walked to the dresser and began to straighten the photos she had disturbed. "I prefer the term curated. Our life was becoming messy. You were asking questions about mileage. You were looking at the walls instead of the windows. I couldn't have that." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. He smelled of peppermint and expensive soap. "I've already taken care of the details," he whispered. "I went home while you were following me. I cleared out your side of the closet. I took your jewelry, your passport, your sketches. I even called the police. I told them you'd had a breakdown, that you'd been talking about hidden rooms and secret lives. They saw the empty house, Sarah, house. They saw the evidence of your instability." He pulled a set of papers from his breast pocket. "These are commitment papers. I used your signature from the design contracts for the new museum. It was remarkably easy to forge. According to the state of Illinois, Sarah Miller is a woman in need of intensive, long-term psychiatric care. But since you've disappeared, the search will be brief." He looked around the room with a sense of pride. "This is your new home. It's perfect, isn't it? No windows to distract you, no doors that lead anywhere. Just you and the version of you that I actually like." He turned to Elena. "Go to the car, Elena. The original is staying here for a while. We have a dinner party at the Johnsons in an hour. You remember the script?" Elena nodded, her movements jerky and mechanical. "I'm sorry, Dor," she whispered as she stepped out of the unit. Mark followed her, his hand on the rolling shutter. "I'll be back in the morning to start the black primer. I think this room needs to be darker, more focused. Goodbye, Sarah." The shutters slammed down. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the most final thing Sarah had ever heard. She was alone in the dark. The silence was a weight, pressing down on her chest. The lavender scent was a shroud. Sarah lay on the bed, her wrists throbbing in the plastic ties. She looked at the ceiling, her mind racing through the dimensions of her prison. 10 by 10, 8-foot ceilings, corrugated steel walls. She wasn't a victim. She was an architect. She began to roll, her body awkward and heavy, until she fell off the bed and hit the floor with a dull thud. She crawled toward the headboard of the bed. It was a custom piece, heavy mahogany, bolted to the floor to ensure it never moved. Mark was a perfectionist, but he wasn't a builder. He had hired contractors to do the heavy lifting, and contractors always took shortcuts. She pressed her back against the headboard and shoved with her legs. The wood groaned. She did it again. Creak. She felt the structural weakness. The headboard wasn't bolted into the concrete. It was screwed into a flimsy wooden frame designed to look like a wall. She kicked. The drywall shattered with a satisfying crunch. Behind it wasn't more steel. It was a ventilation duct, a small, rectangular opening that provided the climate control the facility promised. She used the edge of the broken headboard to saw at the zip ties. The plastic was tough, but the jagged wood was tougher. Snap. Her hands were free. She scrambled into the duct, the cold metal biting into her knees. It was tight, barely 18 inches wide, but she was small. She crawled, the sound of her own breathing echoing like a steam engine in the narrow space. She reached a grate and pushed. It popped out, and she tumbled onto the floor of the main office. The room smelled of ozone and burnt dust. A world's best dad mug sat on the desk, a cruel joke in the sterile space. Sarah lunged for the computer. She didn't need the logs anymore. She needed the system. Her fingers flew across the keys. She opened the design software she used for her floor plans. Most security systems were built on the same basic architecture. She found the override, the back door, that every developer left for themselves. Click. The facility's locks disengaged all at once, a rhythmic clatter that sounded like a round of applause. Stop right there. Sarah froze. She turned slowly. Standing in the doorway was Miller, the associate. But he wasn't holding a knife. He was holding a badge. Robert Miller, Private Investigation, he said. His voice was still a monotone, but the ice in his eyes had melted into something like exhaustion. I've been looking for Elena Brooks for 3 months. Her family hired me when she stopped calling home. Sarah stared at him, her heart refusing to slow down. You were in the unit. You attacked me. I had to keep my cover, Miller said, stepping into the room. Mark is a paranoid man. If I'd helped you then, we would both be dead by now. But I saw what you found. The insurance policy. The contract. Subverted. Sarah felt a wave of relief so violent it made her lightheaded. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She'd managed to grab it before Mark tied her up. I have it. I have the video. I have the logs. I have everything. She handed the phone to Miller. He was the professional. He had the badge. He was the one who could make this stop. Take it, she whispered. Take it to the police. Tell them what he did. Miller took the phone, his fingers brushing hers. He looked at the screen, his face unreadable. You did good, Sarah. This is exactly what we needed. A clean confession, digital evidence, the works. He tucked the phone into his pocket. He looked at his watch. The police are 5 minutes out. I called them the second I saw you break out of that duct. You're safe now. Sarah leaned against the desk, her shoulders finally dropping. The nightmare was over. Mark was going to jail. She was going to get her life back. She closed her eyes, imagining the sun on her face, the smell of real grass, the sound of a world that wasn't measured in 10 by 10 increments. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. Don't thank me yet, Miller said. Something in his tone made Sarah's eyes snap open. Miller wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at her, and he was smiling. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just finished a very long, very profitable game. You see, Sarah? Miller said, his voice dropping to that terrifying monotone. Elena's family didn't hire me to find her. They hired me to make sure she stayed found. They're very wealthy people. And a daughter who's a living installation is a lot less embarrassing than a daughter who's a drug addict in a New York squat. He stepped toward her, and Sarah realized with a jolt of pure horror that the police sirens she heard in the distance weren't coming for Mark. Mark is a genius, Miller continued, his hand closing around her arm. But he's a messy one. He wanted to keep you. I told him it was a mistake. I told him the original always causes problems. But he wouldn't listen. He pulled a small syringe from his pocket. The police will find Mark here, Miller said. They'll find him with the forged papers, the replica room, and a very unfortunate, very unstable wife who took her own life in a fit of despair. And Elena? Elena will go back to her family, a little traumatized, a little confused, but perfectly willing to keep her mouth shut for a few $1 million. Sarah lunged for the door, but Miller was faster. He slammed her against the desk, the world's best dad mug shattering on the floor. "You should have just stayed in the box, Sarah," he hissed. "It was a much better composition." The sirens were closer now, a screaming wail that filled the office. Sarah fought, her nails raking across Miller's face, but the needle was already moving toward her neck. In that moment, the door to the office exploded inward. It wasn't the police. It was Jim. The night watchman stood in the doorway, his face a mask of crumpled parchment and pure, unadulterated rage. He was holding a heavy iron pry bar. 22, 23, 24, he muttered, his voice a low, menacing growl. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked at Miller. "You're parked in a fire lane," Jim said. He swung the pry bar. The sound of the impact was a dull, wet thud. Miller crumpled to the floor, the syringe skittering across the linoleum. Sarah stared at Jim, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The watchman looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "Rules are rules, lady," he grunted. "Now get out of here before I charge you for the broken mug." Sarah didn't wait. She bolted past him, out into the humid night air. The police were pulling into the gravel lot now, their blue and red lights strobing against the silver walls of the storage facility. Sarah saw Mark's SUV. He was standing by the gate, his hands in the air, his face a mask of utter confusion. He wasn't looking at the police. He was looking at her. Sarah walked toward him, her feet planting firmly on the gravel. She didn't stop until she was inches away. She reached into her purse and pulled out her laser measurer. She clicked it on. The red dot landed right in the center of Mark's forehead. 6 feet, she said, her voice as cold and precise as a blueprint. "That's the depth of the hole you just dug for yourself." Mark didn't say a word. He just stared at the red dot, his eyes glazed with a terrifying, obsessive light. The police moved in, their voices a chaotic roar, but Sarah didn't hear them. She turned and walked away, out of the gravel lot, out of Oak Ridge, and into the dark. 3 months later, the New York City skyline was a jagged, beautiful mess of light and shadow. Sarah stood in her new loft, the high ceilings and exposed brick a chaotic contrast to the sterile perfection of her old life. The air smelled of rain and expensive coffee, and the distant, constant roar of traffic. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. It was a million lives overlapping, a million stories that didn't fit into a 10 by 10 box. She looked down at her dining table. It was a massive slab of reclaimed wood, scarred and uneven. On it sat a single chair. She didn't have a laser measurer in her hand. She didn't need to know the dimensions of the room. She reached out and pushed a stack of blueprints off the table. They fluttered to the floor, a chaotic, unscripted mess. Sarah smiled. In a small, sterile cell 300 miles away, Mark Miller sat on his bunk. The walls were white, the floor was gray. The bed was made with a single, perfectly tight sheet. He reached out and straightened a small, hand-drawn calendar on the wall. It was a 1/4 inch off. He adjusted it. Then he sat back, his hands resting flat on his knees, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. The end.